The morning Peter Carver rode into Dusty Creek, Texas, in the spring of 1878, the first thing he heard was a warning, and the last thing he expected was that it would end up being the best advice anyone ever ignored. He had barely tied his roan gelding to the post outside Harlan's General Store when old Bud Macy shuffled over from the shade of the porch, squinting up at him with the kind of expression that suggested he had seen enough young men arrive in this town full of purpose, only to leave it full of defeat. "You the one Sheriff Dawes wired about, the carpenter out of San Antonio?" "That's me," Peter said, pulling off his gloves and tucking them into his belt. "Peter Carver. I'm here to look at the Sutton property. Word is the widow needs some repair work done on her fence lines in her barn." Bud sucked air through his teeth, which made a whistling sound that Peter found immediately irritating. "Word is correct. Word is also that 3 men before you have already ridden out there and come back before noon. She ran 'em off herself. Woman don't want help." Peter looked out toward the edge of town, where the road curved around a cluster of cottonwoods and disappeared into open land. "Then why'd she ask for help?" "She didn't." Bud shook his head. "Her neighbor, old Walt Finney, he's the one who sent word to the sheriff. Said the widow Sutton was too proud to ask but too broke to fix. Said if something ain't done before summer, she'll lose what little she's got left." He paused. "Her late husband, Robert Sutton, he died 2 years back. Rattlesnake bite out on the east pasture. Left her with 60 acres, a son of 12, a daughter of 9, a barn with a leaning wall, and more debt than sense." Peter felt something settle in his chest. Not pity exactly, more like recognition. "What's she like?" Bud gave a short laugh. "Prickly, proud, and near impossible to help." He let the words sit in the air like smoke. "I say that with respect, mind you. She's kept those kids fed through 2 winters alone. That ain't nothing, but she's got a wall around her thicker than any barn wall I've ever seen." Peter reached back to untie his saddlebag and slung it over one shoulder. He looked at Bud with a small, easy smile. "Those are the ones who need it most." Bud blinked at him. "Son, you got a stubborn streak yourself." "Probably," Peter agreed, and walked into the general store to get his bearings before riding out. The store smelled of dried beans and sawdust, which Peter found comforting. He bought a small sack of nails, a length of good rope, and a jar of molasses because it was on the counter and it had been a long ride since breakfast. The woman behind the counter, who introduced herself as Clara Harlan, gave him a long look as she made change. "You're going out to the Sutton place, aren't you?" "Seems that way." Clara folded her hands on the counter. She was a stout woman in her late 40s with kind eyes and a voice like someone who had learned long ago not to mince words. "Lavinia Sutton is a good woman. She is sharp and capable, and she has held that family together with nothing but her own 2 hands and sheer determination since Robert died. She is also, and I say this because I want you to actually succeed where others have not, deeply afraid of being seen as weak. She takes any offer of help as an insult to her competence. You have to come at her sideways." Peter raised an eyebrow. "Sideways? Don't go out there telling her you've been sent to fix her barn. Go out there like you're a man who needs a few days of work and heard she might have use for skilled hands. Make it a transaction. Let her feel like she's doing you a favor, not the other way around." Peter thought about this for a moment. "That's clever." "I have known Lavinia Sutton for 11 years, Clara said. "I know her better than she knows herself. She needs help, and she needs kindness, and she needs somebody who won't flinch when she gets cold. But she also needs her dignity. Don't you dare take that from her." He left the store with Clara's words sitting in his mind and the molasses tucked under his arm, and he rode out along the dusty track toward the Sutton property with a sense of anticipation that he couldn't fully explain, even to himself. He had spent the last 3 years drifting between jobs, between towns, building things and fixing things for people who mostly forgot his name by the time he rode away. He was 31 years old, and he was good at his work, and he had never found a reason to stay anywhere long enough to plant roots. Something about the way the story of the widow Sutton had been laid before him, the pride and the difficulty, and the 2 children and the leaning barn, made him ride a little faster than he had intended. The Sutton property announced itself with a wooden gate that had clearly been repaired recently by someone who knew what they were doing, but had been working with inferior materials. The wire was tight, but the posts were rotting at the base. The house beyond the gate was modest but not neglected. The paint was old and the porch boards were uneven, but there were bright curtains in the windows and a kitchen garden along the south wall that was already showing neat green rows. Someone had been out weeding it recently. The barn to the east did indeed have a wall that leaned inward at a worrying angle, and the fence line along the near pasture had a gap that had been temporarily patched with brush and stacked stones. Peter dismounted at the gate and led his horse through, latching it carefully behind him, and as he walked up toward the house, he saw a boy of about 12 come around from behind the barn and stop dead at the sight of him. "Morning," Peter said. The boy looked at him with eyes that were wary but not unfriendly. He had dusty blonde hair and his mother's cheekbones, though Peter didn't know that yet. "Morning, you ain't from here." "No. I'm from San Antonio. My name's Peter Carver, I'm a carpenter. I heard there might be work in this area." The boy considered this. "I'm Tommy Sutton. My mama's around back." "Thank you, Tommy." He found Lavinia Sutton crouched beside a fence post in the backyard, attempting to drive it deeper into the earth with a maul that was too heavy for the job she was using it on. She was tall for a woman, lean in the way that comes from hard work rather than lack of food, with dark brown hair pulled back under a faded blue bonnet. And she was swinging that maul with an efficiency that told Peter she had been doing physical work her whole life. She heard his boots on the dry ground and straightened up, turning to face him, and the first thing he noticed was her eyes. They were gray-green, the color of sage in early morning, and they looked at him the way a hawk looks at something it can't yet categorize. "This is private property," she said, not impolitely but with the directness of someone who had stopped wasting time on social niceties. "Yes, ma'am. I apologize for the intrusion. My name is Peter Carver. I'm a carpenter and general handyman, passing through the area. I stopped in at Harlan's and Clara mentioned you might be in need of some skilled labor. I'm willing to work for fair wages or trade, whichever suits." He kept his voice easy, his posture open, and he watched her assess him with those sage-colored eyes. She was perhaps 28 or 29, he guessed, though the 2 hard years since her husband's death had put something older than that in her face. Not tired exactly, more like tempered, like steel that had been through the fire and come out harder. "Clara Harlan ought to keep her nose behind her own counter," Lavinia said, which was not exactly a yes but was also not the immediate refusal he had been warned about. She looked at the fence post, then back at him. "What kind of carpenter work?" "Structural mainly. Barns, fences, roofing. I've done flooring, framing, cabinetry. If it's wood and it needs doing, I can do it." She was quiet for a moment and he could see her working through something internal, the pride and the practicality wrestling each other for ground. The barn wall had been tilting toward her for 2 years. She was smart enough to know it. "I don't take charity," she said finally. Her chin was up. "I don't offer it. I get paid for my work or I don't work." She studied him once more. $2 a day and your meals if the work is good. You stay in the barn. And I'll tell you once and only once what needs doing, so I expect you to remember it." "Yes, ma'am." "The barn wall first, then the north fence line. The porch boards are bad near the steps." She paused as though she was about to add something and thought better of it. "We'll see after that." "Understood. I'll start tomorrow morning if that's all right. Let me get my tools arranged tonight." She turned back to her fence post without another word, lifted the maul, and drove it down with a crack that sent it 6 inches deeper into the earth. He took the hint and went to find his horse. He slept in the barn that first night on a clean pile of straw that he suspected she had set out without wanting to acknowledge doing so, and he lay awake for a while listening to the sounds of the Texas night, the frogs and the distant coyotes and the soft breath of the horses in the adjacent stalls. And he thought about the way those gray-green eyes had looked at him, careful and measuring and not without intelligence. In the morning he was up before dawn and had already made a full assessment of the barn wall, before Tommy appeared with a plate of biscuits and bacon wrapped in a cloth. "Mama says breakfast," Tommy said, setting the plate down on a hay bale with the gravity of someone delivering important dispatches. "Thank her for me." "She won't like that." Tommy sat on the hay bale. "She doesn't like people being grateful. It makes her uncomfortable." Peter looked at the boy with interest. 12 years old and already reading his mother with that kind of clarity. "Then I won't say anything. I'll just eat the biscuits." Tommy gave him a conspiratorial grin that briefly made him look exactly like the child he was trying very hard not to be. "That's the right answer." Peter worked from sunup to sundown on that barn wall for 3 days. It was genuine, difficult work. The foundation logs were partly rotted, and 3 of the vertical supports had been compromised, and he had to dig down and pour new footings with mixed limestone and water and brace everything in stages, so that the wall didn't come down in a pile while he was working on it. Tommy helped, handing him tools and holding boards in place, and turned out to be a remarkably useful assistant for his size, steady and attentive and genuinely interested in how things fit together. Lavinia came to inspect on the second morning, standing at the barn door with her arms crossed and watching him work without comment. He kept his focus on the joint he was cutting and let the silence sit between them without trying to fill it. After perhaps 10 minutes, she said, "You dovetail your corners." "Yes, ma'am. Stronger than a butt joint and it won't pull apart in the weather." Another silence. Robert didn't dovetail. He wasn't sure whether she was criticizing her late husband or simply observing. He decided to answer as though it were simply an observation. "It takes a little longer. But it'll hold through another 20 years of Texas wind." She watched him make 2 more cuts. He could feel her reassessing him, and he made a conscious decision not to care whether the assessment was favorable. He was here to do good work. The assessment would take care of itself. "There will be coffee at midday," she said, and went back to the house. He found over the following days that this was how Lavinia Sutton communicated approval, not in words but in acts. Coffee at midday became a given. The plate at breakfast got a bit larger. She began leaving a bucket of fresh water near wherever he was working without being asked. When he came in for supper on the 4th evening, having finished the barn wall to his own satisfaction and begun on the north fence, she had set a place at the table proper rather than leaving a plate on the porch. There was also a daughter, Eliza, who was 9 and had her mother's gray-green eyes and her father's apparent fearlessness. She appeared at Peter's elbow on the 4th morning while he was setting fence posts, holding a small bucket of water with both hands, and announced, "I'm helping." "I can see that," he said, taking a careful drink. "Much appreciated. Mama says I shouldn't bother you." "You're not bothering me." She sat down in the dirt beside his post hole and watched with her chin in her hands. "Did you know that a fence post needs to be in the ground 1/3 of its total length to stay put? Tommy told me. He learned it from you." "Tommy's right." "I thought it was interesting," Eliza said, with the tone of someone who finds most things interesting. "Can I help measure?" He handed her the rope he was using as a guide line and showed her how to keep it taut, and she did it with total concentration and not a word of complaint for the next 2 hours. At noon she ran back to the house, and he heard her voice carrying over the wind, telling her mother something in a bright, excited tone that made him smile though he couldn't make out the words. That evening at supper, which was a good beef stew with cornbread, Lavinia looked at him across the table and said, "Eliza tells me she helped with the fence posts today." "She was useful," he said honestly. Lavinia looked at him for a moment longer than the conversation seemed to require. "She talks to everyone," she said, which might have been an apology or might have been simply a fact. "I don't mind." A brief silence. Tommy reached for more cornbread and Eliza made a small sound about the gravy, and Peter thought that if he had painted a picture of what a family's supper table ought to look and sound like, it might have looked something like this: the warm lamplight and the sound of spoons on crockery, and the children's voices filling in the spaces that a different kind of absence made. He didn't say any of this. He asked Tommy how the calf in the east paddock was doing, because Tommy had mentioned it had been off its feed, and they talked about cattle for the rest of the meal. He had been at the Sutton property for 10 days when the trouble came. It arrived in the form of a man named Doyle Carver, who rode in on a big gray horse one afternoon while Peter was working on the porch steps and Lavinia was hanging laundry on the line. Carver was perhaps 50, broad across the shoulders, and wore the particular expression of a man who is accustomed to being given what he wants without too many questions. He had 2 men with him who sat back on their horses and watched everything with the flat eyes of hired patience. Peter kept his hands moving on the porch board he was planing, but his attention shifted entirely to what was unfolding in the yard. "Lavinia," Carver said, not bothering with the formality of dismounting, "I've come to make my offer again, in person this time, since you apparently aren't inclined to respond to letters." Lavinia turned from the laundry line. She was holding a wet shirt and she didn't set it down. Her posture was calm in the way that suggested a great deal was being held still by force of will. "My answer hasn't changed, Doyle. Your circumstances have." "My answer hasn't changed." Carver glanced toward the barn, toward the fence line, and his eyes stopped briefly on Peter. "I see you've taken on help. That's my business." "It is," Carver agreed in a tone that made it sound like he was conceding a small point while planning to take a much larger one. "My offer stands, Lavinia. $500 for the South 40. That's more than fair for land that's mortgaged to the Whitfield Bank and coming due in August." Peter's hand slowed on the plane. He hadn't known about the mortgage. Lavinia didn't blink. "The South 40 has the only reliable water source on this property. I sell you that land, I lose access to the creek. I lose the creek, I lose the cattle. I lose the cattle, I lose everything else in 6 months. You know that as well as I do." Carver smiled with his mouth only. "That's not my concern." "No," Lavinia said. "It's mine, and I intend to handle it. Good day, Doyle." There was a long moment in which Carver sat on his gray horse and looked at her, and Peter could feel the weight of the moment the way you feel weather coming. Then Carver turned his horse and rode out, his men trailing behind, and didn't look back. Lavinia went back to the laundry with a steadiness that Peter found both admirable and heartbreaking. She hung the wet shirt with precise movements, and then stood for a moment with her back to the house and her hands in the laundry basket, and he could see from the set of her shoulders that she was doing something invisible and necessary, pulling herself back together. He set down the plane and walked over, stopping a few feet away. "I didn't know about the mortgage." She turned. For just a moment, something that might have been vulnerability crossed her face before the composure came back. "It's not your concern either." "It is, a little. I'm working on this property and I should understand its situation." She looked at him with those sage-colored eyes, weighing something. "Robert took the mortgage 2 years before he died to buy the cattle. We were building the herd. It was a good plan." She paused. "Then he died and the debt didn't. How much is left?" "More than I have." She said it flatly without drama. "But I have until August, and I have the calves from last spring's breeding that I can take to market in June. If the prices hold and I'm lucky, I might cover enough of it to get an extension from the bank." "And Carver?" "Doyle Carver has wanted this land since before Robert and I settled it. He has 3,000 acres to the north, and he wants to push south to the creek. He is patient, and he is not above using other people's bad luck to his advantage." She picked up the laundry basket. "But he has not beaten me yet." "No," Peter said. "He hasn't." She looked at him for a moment, and he thought again about what Clara had said, about coming at her sideways, about not taking her dignity. He didn't offer to help with the mortgage. He didn't offer advice. He picked up the plane and went back to the porch steps, and after a moment he heard her go inside. But that night, by the light of the lantern in the barn, he sat with a scrap of paper and a stub of pencil and worked through the numbers he knew about what good cattle brought at the Abilene market, what the June drives typically returned per head, what a fair extension agreement might look like, and he thought about what other resources she might not have considered. He wasn't going to lay any of this in her path unless she asked, but he wanted to be ready in case she did. Over the following days, something shifted between them, subtly and without announcement. It was in the way she began to speak to him more directly during their evening meals, asking his opinion on things, not as though she needed his opinion, but as though she found it interesting to have someone to test her thinking against. It was in the way he would occasionally come in from the fence line to find that she had already made a decision about something that used to make her stall for days, and the decision was almost always good. And it was in the small things, the way she began to bring his coffee out herself in the mornings instead of sending Tommy, the way she sometimes stopped to watch him work with an expression that was no longer purely professional assessment. He noticed that she never talked about Robert unless one of the children brought him up. When they did, her voice would go careful in a way that was not cold but was clearly protected. She had loved her husband and she had grieved him, and she had then walled the grief away somewhere useful and gotten back to living. He understood that kind of strength. He also understood that it came at a cost. On a warm Thursday evening, about 3 weeks into his time at the property, Tommy and Eliza had gone to bed early because they'd been up since before dawn for a cattle check, and Peter and Lavinia sat on the porch in the quiet that the children's absence left behind. The sunset was spectacular, as Texas sunsets tend to be, a wide wash of orange and pink across the sky that turned the dust on the road to gold. Lavinia sat with her coffee cup in both hands and looked at it for a long time. "You could have taken other work," she said eventually. "In town, Bud Macy mentioned his stable needs new beams and the schoolhouse roof is going." "The schoolhouse roof can wait another season. The barn wall couldn't." She looked at him sideways. "You knew about the schoolhouse roof." "I had a conversation with Harlan's wife, a beat. She told you about the mortgage too, didn't she?" He didn't lie. "She told me you were in a difficult position and that you wouldn't ask for help." Lavinia looked back at the sunset. A muscle worked in her jaw, but when she spoke her voice was steady. "And yet here you are. Here I am." She was quiet for a moment. "Most people who try to help do it in a way that makes you feel small, like you're a problem they're solving." "I'm not trying to solve you," he said. "I'm just working your fence line." She turned to look at him then, really look at him, and something in the look was different from all the careful assessing she'd been doing. This was more direct, more open, as though she had decided just then to lower one section of the wall. "Why did you come here, Peter Carver? The truth." He thought about lying or giving a partial answer and decided against both. "I heard there was a widow who was prickly and proud and impossible to help. I've spent 3 years taking jobs that didn't matter much to anyone. I wanted to take one that did." She held his gaze. The sunset was doing extraordinary things behind her, and he was having some difficulty keeping his attention on the conversation rather than on the way the light fell across her face, but he managed it. "That's either the most honest thing anyone has said to me in 2 years," she said, "or the most practiced. It's honest." She looked back at the last of the sunset. "I suppose the fence line is better for it." He smiled and she didn't see it, but Tommy did, because he had gotten up for a glass of water and was watching from behind the screen door with the large, knowing eyes of a 12-year-old who is paying much closer attention to the adult world than adults generally assume. Tommy shut the screen door very quietly and went back to bed with something to think about. The next week brought a new problem in the form of weather. A late spring storm rolled in from the southwest with more ferocity than the season had any right to produce, and Peter spent a tense afternoon reinforcing the barn wall he had just finished as the wind built from the wrong direction, and the sky turned the particular yellow-green that experienced Texans knew to take seriously. Lavinia got the children into the root cellar under the house and then came back out to help him drive additional stakes along the windward side of the barn while lightning split the sky to the west. "Go inside," he told her over the rising wind. "It's my barn," she said, taking one end of a brace board and holding it steady while he drove the stake. The rain hit about 4 minutes later, coming in sideways, and they were both soaked through before they reached the house. She pushed him through the door ahead of her with an authoritative hand on his shoulder, and went to get blankets from the cedar chest with a focused efficiency that suggested She had weathered storms alone for long enough that having another pair of capable hands felt disorienting in a good way. They sat at the kitchen table while the storm shook the windows, wrapped in blankets and drinking hot coffee, and Tommy and Eliza came up from the root cellar once the thunder began to pass. Eliza with her hair full of cobwebs and Tommy trying hard to look unimpressed by all of it and mostly succeeding. Lavinia made supper right there, just salt pork and beans and more cornbread, and the four of them ate while the rain fell steadily and the lamp threw warm shadows on the walls. Peter looked around that table and felt something he hadn't felt in a very long time. Not just the pleasant warmth of company which he had experienced in plenty of different places, but something more specific and more specific to this place, this table, these four walls. He filed the feeling away carefully, the way you file something important when you're not yet sure what to do with it. The next morning the sun came back as though it had never left, the way it does in Texas, and Peter walked the whole property checking for storm damage. The barn wall had held perfectly. There were 2 broken fence rails on the east side, a tree limb down across the north gate, and a section of the kitchen garden's edging had washed away. He was clearing the limb from the gate when Lavinia appeared with a wheelbarrow and began loading the smaller branches without preamble. "Wall held," he said. "I noticed. She loaded a branch. Good dovetailing." He laughed. It came out before he could stop it, a genuine laugh that surprised him, and when he looked at her she was fighting a smile of her own, pressing her lips together to contain it and not quite succeeding. It was the first time he had seen her genuinely close to laughing, and the sight of it did something complicated to the region of his chest. "I'll take that as a professional compliment," he said. "Take it however you like," she said, but the smile had escaped the corners of her mouth and was sitting there in the morning sun, and he thought it was the most pleasant thing he had seen in quite a long time. They worked side by side on the storm cleanup through the morning, and it was easy work. The kind of work where you fall into a rhythm with another person and stop thinking about the fact that you're working together and just do the thing. She knew where everything was and what needed doing, and she communicated it economically, and he matched her pace and her efficiency. And by midday, they had the property looking better than it had before the storm in several respects. At midday she made sandwiches of salt pork and mustard, and they ate them sitting on the tailgate of the wagon in the yard. And she asked him about San Antonio, and he told her about the buildings he'd worked on there. The hotel with the Spanish tiles and the Presbyterian church with the bell tower that had given him 3 weeks of genuine satisfaction to get right. She listened with the focused attention she gave to everything, and asked questions that were specific and showed she'd been hearing what he said. And he thought that a conversation with Lavinia Sutton was like being taken seriously in a way that not many people managed. He asked about the property, about what her plans were for the summer, and she talked about the cattle drive in June with a precision that told him she had been working through the numbers in her head for months. She knew her herd count, she knew the market prices from last season, she knew what freight was running from the local traders. She was not a woman who waited for the world to tell her things. She went and found them out. "Have you considered asking the Whitfield Bank for a payment schedule extension before June?" he asked. "Rather than waiting to see what the market brings." She looked at him. "Banks don't do favors. They do when it's better for them than a default. If you go to them in April with a clear accounting of your assets, your herd count, your projected return from the June market, and a proposed extension of 3 months, they have a strong incentive to give it to you. They don't want to foreclose on a working ranch. It's costly for them and they end up with land they have to sell. A borrower in good standing who just needs a little time is worth more to them than a foreclosure." She was quiet, thinking this through. He could see her doing the calculation, the pride calculation as much as the financial one. "I've never spoken to the bank about the mortgage directly," she said. "Robert handled it." "I know, but you're not Robert." She looked at him sharply and he thought for a moment he had overstepped, but then she nodded slowly as though accepting something. "No," she said, "I'm not. You know more about the practical state of this ranch than he did at the end. You know the cattle count, you know the grazing rotation, you know what the land can carry. You have a better case to present than he might have had." She was still for a long moment, looking out at the pasture where the cattle moved slowly in the midday heat. Then she said quietly, "You've been thinking about this." "A little. You said it wasn't your concern." "I said it was a little my concern. I'm here working on the property. I'd like it to still be here in September." She turned to look at him, and there was something in her expression that he couldn't fully read, something layered and real, not the cool, composed face she presented to the world, but something underneath it that was more complicated and more alive. She held his gaze for what felt like a long time, and then she looked down at the sandwich in her hands. "I'll think about it," she said. She went to the bank in Dusty Creek the following Thursday. She went alone, dressed in her best dark dress, and she was back before supper with an expression Peter couldn't read until Tommy set the table, and she said, in a tone of almost studied casualness, "The bank has agreed to extend the payment due date to September 1st, contingent on a partial payment from the June market." Eliza clapped her hands. Tommy looked up with bright eyes. Peter kept his face neutral because he knew she would not want a fuss. "That's good news," he said simply. "It is," she agreed, and sat down and put her napkin in her lap, and he thought he saw, very briefly, a brightness in those sage-colored eyes that was relief so profound it had turned into something like joy. He looked away before she could see him seeing it. Over the days that followed, the shape of things between them continued to change in ways that were noticeable to everyone on the property except, possibly, Lavinia, though he suspected that wasn't entirely true. She began to ask his opinion not just on practical matters, but on broader things, whether he thought the government land grants were being administered fairly, whether he believed the railroads were a good thing for small ranchers in the long run, what he thought about the treatment of the Comanche who had been forced off this very land in the decade before the Suttons settled it. He appreciated that she asked that last one, and he told her so, and told her honestly that he thought the injustices of the expansion west were going to sit on this country's conscience for generations, that you could not build something decent on a foundation of that kind of wrong without it eventually mattering. She agreed with a gravity that suggested she had thought about it herself. "Robert and I came here in 1869, she said. "We were young and we wanted land and we got it. I've never stopped thinking about who was on it before us. You're not wrong to think about it. It doesn't change what happened." "No," he said, "but it means you're not pretending. That's something." She looked at him in the quiet way she had when something had landed in an unexpected place. "You're an unusual man, Peter Carver." He wasn't sure what to do with that, so he just said, "I've been told." Eliza, who had been ostensibly reading her primer at the end of the table and had in fact been listening to every word, looked up and said, "I think Mr. Carver is very nice." "Nobody asked you," Tommy told her. "Nobody asks me anything interesting," Eliza said serenely and went back to her primer. Lavinia looked at Peter. Peter looked at his coffee. Both of them were suppressing smiles that had no particular right to be on their faces, given the perfectly ordinary nature of the conversation, and both of them knew it, and neither of them said so. The month of May settled over the property with warmth and the smell of dry grass and wild sage, and Peter worked his way through the list Lavinia had given him and added things to it as he found them. A loose roof beam in the storage room, a broken hinge on the root cellar door, a crack in the cistern that would cause serious water loss by summer if left unaddressed. He fixed all of it without making a production of it, and she paid him with steady reliability and the daily acknowledgement that grew from cups of coffee to actual conversation to the kind of easy working partnership that has its own quiet pleasure. He rode into town twice a week for supplies, and on one of these trips Clara Harlan caught his arm at the counter and said, in a voice just low enough that her husband wouldn't hear from the back room, "You're still there." "I am." "Nobody's been out at the Sutton place more than a week before she sent them off." "She hasn't sent me off." Clara looked at him with the combination of satisfaction and concern that older women deploy toward young men who are falling into something they might not fully see. "How is she?" "She's well. She went to the bank about the mortgage." Clara's eyebrows went up. "Lavinia went to the bank herself." "She did." Clara pressed her lips together and looked emotional in a way she was clearly deciding not to be in a public setting. "Well," she said, recovering herself, "I'm glad." "She's a capable woman," Peter said. "She just needed someone to get out of the way and let her be." Clara looked at him with a great deal of meaning in her eyes. "Is that what you're doing? Getting out of the way?" He paid for his nails and his flour and didn't answer the question, but he thought about it on the ride back, through the cottonwoods and out onto the open land where the road stretched ahead of him, and the sky was enormous, and the wind smelled of sage and coming summer. He thought about it for a long time. It was on a Friday evening in the middle of May that the thing happened that he had not planned for and could not have managed his way around even if he'd tried. He had been up since before dawn fixing the cistern, and had come in for supper tired in the bone-deep way that good hard work produces. And Lavinia had made a roast with potatoes and onions that smelled so good it was briefly all he could think about. They ate, and the children were more talkative than usual because Tommy had found a horned toad that afternoon and brought it in for examination, and Eliza had named it William. And the conversation about whether William the horned toad was happy in the wooden box Tommy had put him in carried them through most of the meal with a warmth that Peter found himself simply sitting inside of, not trying to manage or analyze, just sitting inside of it. After Tommy and Eliza were in bed, Peter was on the porch getting ready to go back to the barn, and Lavinia came out to put the leftover food in the cooling box and then stood at the porch rail looking at the dark yard. There was a nearly full moon, big and bright enough to cast shadows, and the night was warm and fragrant with the smell of the flowering creosote bush along the fence. He should have said good night and gone to the barn. He knew that. Instead he stayed where he was, leaning against the post and looked at the moon and thought about absolutely nothing in particular. After a while she said, "I want to tell you something." He waited. "When Walt Finney sent word to Sheriff Dawes about my property, I was furious. I knew what he'd done and I knew people in town were talking about me and I wanted every single one of them to mind their own business." She paused. "I was going to send you away the moment you rode in. I had the speech ready." "I know," he said. "Clara warned me." A short, surprised laugh. "Of course she did." She turned to look at him. The moonlight was doing the same thing to her face that the sunset had done weeks ago, finding all the lines that hard years had put there and making them look like something other than hardship, something like character. What she didn't know and what you apparently figured out on your own was what would actually work with me. Making it a transaction, he said. Yes, she was quiet for a moment, but it stopped being a transaction about 10 days in. I think you know that. I do. She looked at him steadily. There was no composure wall up right now. It was just her, standing in the moonlight, telling him the truth. I have been alone for 2 years and I have managed it because I didn't have a choice. My children needed me to manage it. The land needed me to manage it. There was never room to be anything other than what the day required. She stopped, started again. And then you came along and you fixed my barn and you didn't treat me like a problem. And you talked to me like a person, and you got out of the way when I needed room, and I don't know exactly what to do with that. He pushed off the post and turned to face her properly. The moon was very bright and the night was very still, and he was 31 years old and had never in his life said the next thing carefully enough, and he was going to try to do it right this time. I don't know what you want to do with it, he said, but I know what I want. She held his gaze. Do you? I want to stay. He said it simply, without decoration. Not finish the fence line and ride to the next town. Stay. He waited a breath. If that's something you want too. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of everything she was working through, all the practical objections and the pride objections and the grief that still sat somewhere in the architecture of her, and he let her work through it without prompting because she deserved the time to do it honestly. You would have to understand, she said finally, that this is a hard life. The mortgage isn't gone, it's just later. The land needs constant work. I have 2 children who are not yours and who would need to know what you are to them. I understand all of that, and I would need you to be honest with me, always. I have enough people in my life who soften things to protect me. I don't want that. I've been honest with you from the day I rode in. Yes, she said, you have. She was quiet for another moment and then she said, the children like you. I like them. Eliza thinks you're wonderful. Eliza is 8 excellent years old. 9, Lavinia corrected with a small smile. She's 9. 9, he agreed. Even more excellent. She was quiet and the smile was still there, soft and real, and she looked at him with those sage-colored eyes in the moonlight, and something final shifted in her expression, the last of the wall not crumbling but being deliberately set aside, brick, by her own hands. You're going to be very hard to be prickly at, she said. I'll try not to make it too difficult. She looked at him for one more long moment and then she did something he hadn't expected. She reached out and put her hand over his where it rested on the porch rail, just for a moment, just the brief warm weight of it, and then she took her hand back and said, "Good night, Peter Carver," in a voice that was quieter and warmer than any version of her he'd heard before. He stood on the porch in the moonlight for a while after she went inside, feeling something in his chest that was light and warm and very specific. And then he walked to the barn and lay down on his straw and looked at the stars through the knothole in the roof he'd been meaning to patch and thought that he'd get to it tomorrow. June came, and with it, the cattle drive. Lavinia had arranged with a neighboring rancher named Gil Tanner to join his drive to the market at Abilene, which was the nearest large market running that season. Peter drove the cattle with Tommy alongside Gil's hands, a 2-day journey each way, while Lavinia stayed with Eliza and managed the property. He had offered before leaving to stay if she wanted company, and she had looked at him with a calm directness and said she had been managing this property alone for 2 years and she would manage it for 4 more days without difficulty. Thank you. He had smiled and said, I know you can. Then stop offering, she said, but there was no edge in it. The market was good, better than good. The beef prices were up from the previous year, and the buyers from the northern territories were competitive. Peter kept count and calculated, and when they got back to Dusty Creek, he handed Lavinia the accounting with everything laid out clearly, what each head had brought, what the freight costs had been, what Gil Tanner's percentage came to, and what the remainder was. She read it twice, and her face did the thing it did when something had worked out better than she'd allowed herself to hope. This covers the partial payment, she said, with money left, more than enough for the partial payment. The September balance is going to be close, but if the summer pasture holds and you get a good fall breeding season, you'll be ahead of it by November. She looked at him over the accounting paper. You calculated the fall season projections. It's just arithmetic. You did it because you wanted to know the property was going to survive. He didn't argue with that because it was true. She folded the paper carefully and set it on the table. I'm going to the bank on Monday, she said. Would you come with me? It was the first time she had asked him to come with her somewhere rather than just accepting that he was here. He understood the difference. Yes, he said, I'd be glad to. He went to the Whitfield Bank on Monday with Lavinia and sat beside her while she laid out the accounting with a precision and composure that would have impressed a man twice her experience. And the bank manager, a careful man named Hollies, accepted the partial payment and extended the September deadline without a murmur of resistance. Outside on the wooden sidewalk afterward, with the noise of the town around them, Lavinia stood in the sunshine and breathed out a long, slow breath. That's done, she said. It is. She turned to look at him. There were people passing on the street and a dog barking somewhere nearby and the smell of dust and horses that is the permanent smell of a western town in June, and she looked at him with a directness that had nothing held back in it and said, Thank you. Not the way she said it about the fence posts or the barn wall, something else. You did that, he said. I was just there. She shook her head slightly, almost impatiently, as though this was not an argument she intended to have on a public street. Then she said, Are you coming back to the property? Were you planning to leave me on the sidewalk? Something that was almost a laugh. Let's go home, she said, and then, very quickly, as though the word had escaped rather than been chosen, she caught herself. He let it go past without comment. She fell into step beside him toward the hitching post where their horses were tied, and they rode back together through the cottonwoods and the open land with the afternoon sun warm on their backs, and a comfortable silence between them that had the character of two people who have found their particular rhythm with each other, and are not in any hurry to break it. In the weeks that followed, the shift between them happened in the way that real things happen between people, not dramatically, but in accumulation. He started sitting on the porch with her after the children were in bed more evenings than not, talking about anything and nothing, Texas weather and the politics of the railroad, and the books she sometimes borrowed from Clara's small lending shelf, which turned out to be more interesting than he would have predicted. She had opinions about books, strong ones. He disagreed with her about a novel by Sir Walter Scott that she found overwrought, and he found excellent. And they argued about it for 3 separate evenings with a pleasure in the arguing that neither of them missed the point of. He found over this time that he was learning her the way you learn a piece of land you intend to stay on, not just its features but its moods, the way the light changed across her face in different kinds of weather, the way she got quiet when she was worried about something, and the very specific kind of quiet that meant she was already working on a solution and didn't want interruption, the way she laughed, which was rarer than it should have been and therefore, when it happened, struck him with a force that was a little disproportionate. He also learned things about Robert Sutton, not from Lavinia herself, who still kept those years protected, but from the children. From Tommy, who mentioned his father with a mix of grief and pride that was very 12 years old. From Eliza, who remembered him mostly in flashes, the smell of his coat, a song he'd sung, the particular way he'd made pancakes on Sunday mornings. Peter listened to these things and did not try to fill the space they described. Robert Sutton had been real and had been loved and had left a specific absence in this family. Peter was not here to occupy that absence. He was here as himself, which was a different shape. One afternoon he found Tommy behind the barn attempting to repair a cracked axe handle with a method that would not hold, and he sat down next to him and showed him a better way, wrapping the crack with wet rawhide that would shrink tight as it dried. Tommy worked beside him carefully, learning the technique with the same focused attention he brought to everything, and when they were done he sat for a moment with the axe across his knees. "Are you going to stay?" Tommy asked, not accusatory. Just direct the way he was. "That's my intention," Peter said. Tommy looked at the axe handle. "My dad was a good man. I believe that." "He would have liked you," Tommy said, with the particular confidence of a 12-year-old who has decided something and means it. He liked people who knew how to do things properly. He stood up, shouldering the axe. "Don't make Mama sad. She's had enough of that." "That's the last thing I want to do," Peter said. Tommy nodded once as though that settled it and carried the axe back to the barn with the walk of a boy who is working very hard at becoming a man. Peter watched him go and felt something in his chest that was not unlike what he felt about Eliza and the property and Lavinia herself. A specific, profound investment in how this all turned out. The trouble with Doyle Casper came to a head in the middle of July, and it was less dramatic than Peter had feared and more straightforward than Casper had probably intended. Casper had apparently gotten word of the bank extension and decided to take a more direct approach, which in this case meant riding to the property with a legal document that he claimed gave him right-of-way access to the South Creek through the Sutton property, a claim based on an old survey notation that was, on examination, both ambiguous and predating the Sutton deed. He arrived one hot Tuesday morning with a lawyer from Abilene and the same 2 silent men on horses, and Lavinia met him at the gate with her arms crossed and her chin up and listened to the lawyer's presentation without interrupting it. When it was done, she said, "I've seen that notation. It refers to a wagon road that existed before 1860 and was abandoned when the main road was rerouted north. It doesn't establish any current right-of-way." The lawyer blinked. He had, Peter suspected, expected a lone widow to be somewhat less prepared. "The notation could be interpreted," the lawyer started. "It could be interpreted in your client's favor if no one who knows the history of this land is present," Lavinia said pleasantly. "I know the history of this land, and I also know that if Doyle Casper had a genuine legal claim to anything on my property, he wouldn't have spent the last 2 years trying to buy it. He would have simply filed the claim. The fact that he's only now presenting a document suggests to me that someone spent the last week looking very hard for something that could be made to sound like it supported his position." She paused. "You are welcome to take that notation to any judge in this county. I am not worried about the result." Casper sat on his gray horse and looked at her with an expression that had passed through anger and come out the other side into something that might, eventually, resolve into respect. "You've gotten harder to deal with, Lavinia," he said. "I always was," she replied. "You just weren't paying attention." They left. Peter, who had been standing by the barn during all of this with a planing tool in his hand he hadn't touched, watched them go and then looked at Lavinia, who turned from the gate and walked back toward the house with the steady, purposeful walk she always had. And he thought that she was, without question, the most remarkable person he had ever known. She stopped when she drew even with him. "Well," she said. "Well," he agreed. "I've been ready for that conversation for a year," she said. "Since the first time he made the offer." She looked at him. "You had something to do with that. You had everything to do with that. You taught me how to trust my own accounting," she said, "which taught me to trust my own judgment about other things." She looked at him steadily. "I'm not giving you credit you don't want. I'm just being accurate." He set down the planing tool. The sun was very bright, and the air smelled of baked earth and sage, and the faint sweetness of the flowering grass along the fence line. He had been building toward this moment for weeks, not planning it but feeling it coming the way you feel a change in the weather. "Lavinia," he said. She looked at him with those sage-colored eyes, the wall entirely down now, just her standing there in the summer sun. "I love you," he said. "I have for a while. I wanted to say it plainly." She was quiet for a long moment. He had not expected anything other than quiet. She was not a woman who answered important things quickly. "I know," she said. "I've known for a while." She paused. "I'm not good at this. I'm not soft and I'm not easy, and I will argue with you about Sir Walter Scott until the end of time. I know. And I have 2 children who come before everything else, including whatever this is. I know that too." She looked at him. The stillness that came over her then was different from all the other stills he'd learned in her. It was something that was resolving, something that had been held in suspension for a long time and was now setting. "I love you back," she said. "I need you to understand that I don't say that lightly. I've only ever said it to one other person. I understand." "Then we understand each other," she said. He reached out and took her hand, which was calloused and strong and warm, and she let him hold it, standing there in the middle of her yard in the Texas summer sun. And after a moment she turned her fingers through his with a naturalness that felt like something that had always been waiting to be exactly this. That evening at supper, nothing was announced. There was no formal declaration. Lavinia simply set 2 chairs on the same side of the porch after supper instead of at separate ends, and the children observed this with varying degrees of subtlety. Eliza immediately sat in Peter's lap and announced that she thought this was an excellent arrangement. Tommy pretended to read a copy of a horse breeding almanac he'd gotten from Gil Tanner's hand, and looked up occasionally with a small, satisfied expression that he was, for a 12-year-old, managing to keep fairly contained. The rest of July passed with a fullness that Peter had not experienced in his adult life, a sense that each day had weight and meaning, and that the place he woke up in the morning was the place he was supposed to be. The work on the property was nearly finished now, or rather it had evolved from the original list into the ongoing maintenance of a working ranch that was being cared for by 2 people who knew what they were doing, and it felt less like employment and more like life. In early August, He rode to town and came back with a small package from the jeweler in Abilene that he'd written for 2 weeks earlier. And that evening after supper, when the children were at the table doing their schoolwork and Lavinia was at the stove with her back to him, he came in and waited until she turned around, and then he held out the package. She looked at him, then at the package, and he watched her put it together with an expression that was, for just a moment, purely and entirely open. No composure, no management, just a woman standing in her kitchen being reached by something that mattered. She opened it. It was a ring of plain gold, modest and honest, which was what she would want. "I'm not a man who makes speeches," he said, "but I'm a man who builds things to last. I'd like to build something that lasts with you." She looked at the ring for a long moment and then at him. "The children," she said, "they'll have their mother, they'll have me. I'm not trying to replace what they've lost. I'm just trying to be something new that's also good." She nodded, slowly. Then she held out her left hand, which was steady and sure, and he put the ring on her finger, and she looked at it on her hand and said nothing for a moment, just looked at it. Then she raised her eyes to his, and what was in them was clear and real and without reservation. And she put her arms around him, and he held her in the kitchen while the lamplight moved, and the children, who had gone entirely silent over their schoolwork, exchanged a look across the table. Tommy looked at Eliza. Eliza looked at Tommy. Then Eliza turned back to her primer with a smile she was not bothering to contain, and Tommy turned back to his arithmetic. And after a moment he wrote something in his arithmetic book that had nothing to do with arithmetic, which was simply the word good underlined twice, and then he erased it because he was 12 and some things are private. They were married in September in the church in Dusty Creek on a clear, bright day that smelled of autumn coming in. Clara Harlan cried, which surprised no one. Old Bud Macy attended, and told anyone who would listen that he had predicted this outcome from the very first morning. Lavinia looked at Peter during the ceremony with those sage-colored eyes steady and clear, and said her words with the full weight of someone who does not say things lightly. And he said his words and meant all of them. And when the minister said the final blessing, the congregation responded with a warmth that was, in part, the warmth of a small town that had watched a woman survive something hard and arrive at something good. Tommy stood at the front of the church as Peter's witness with his hair combed, and his coat buttoned, and the careful posture of a young man taking a serious thing seriously. Eliza was her mother's attendant and threw flower petals with an enthusiasm that resulted in everyone within 3 pews getting somewhat covered, which she found entirely satisfactory. After the ceremony there was a gathering at the property, with tables set up in the yard and half the town appearing with food and fiddle music, and the late afternoon light turned everything gold, and the smell of the food and the sound of the music carried out across the pasture. And Peter stood next to Lavinia with her hand in his, and felt the specific, anchored weight of being exactly where you are supposed to be. He leaned down and said, quietly near her ear, "Are you all right?" She turned her face up to him, and she was smiling, fully and without reservation, the smile that had been rare enough that he'd felt it like a physical thing every time he'd seen it. "I'm very all right," she said. "Don't ask me again for a while." He laughed. She turned back to the gathering with his hand still in hers and the ring on her finger in the September light. The bank payment in September was made in full, 2 days ahead of the deadline, and when Lavinia came out of the Whitfield Bank onto the wooden sidewalk, she stood in the sun for a moment and closed her eyes, and Peter waited beside her and let her have the moment. When she opened them, she looked at him with a brightness that was the particular brightness of a burden fully set down, the kind that has been carried so long you've forgotten what it felt like not to carry it. "That's finished," she said. "That's finished," he agreed. "We own this property free and clear." "You do." "We," she said firmly. "We own it." He said nothing, but he put his arm around her shoulders on the public sidewalk of Dusty Creek, Texas, which was not something he would have done 2 months ago without knowing how she would receive it, and she settled against him with a naturalness that made it clear she had been waiting for exactly this. The autumn was the best season Peter had ever spent anywhere, and he had spent seasons in enough places to have a fair comparison. The property was in good repair by then, not just functional but genuinely solid, the barn wall straight and true, the fence lines tight, the porch steps level, the cistern whole, and the new section of flooring he'd put in the kitchen over the course of several evenings, while Lavinia worked at the table nearby, talking to him about her plans for the spring breeding season. There was a different quality to the work now, a permanence. He was not fixing someone else's property, he was maintaining his own. Tommy was growing into himself with the particular speed of 12 turning 13, and Peter found in him both a willing student and, increasingly, something more like a companion. They rode the fence line together on Saturday mornings, checking for wear and the occasional damage from the longhorns rubbing posts loose, and these rides became a time when Tommy asked questions about things that were plainly on his mind, but that he was still learning how to ask out loud. About his father sometimes. About what it meant to be the man of a property when you were still growing into the idea. About girls once in the most oblique possible terms, which Peter answered in the most useful terms he could manage while keeping his face entirely composed. Lavinia asked Peter afterward, with a very particular look on her face, whether Tommy had seemed embarrassed, and Peter said that Tommy had seemed thoughtful, and Lavinia said that was probably the best outcome possible, and then she turned away with a smile she was trying to hold back, and he thought, not for the first time, that she was extraordinary. Eliza continued to be Eliza, which meant that she accumulated information about everything around her at a rate that should have been impossible for someone of her size, and delivered it with the cheerful authority of someone who has never encountered the concept of an inappropriate time to share knowledge. She had by October trained William the horned toad to come out of his box for meal worms, which she considered a scientific achievement, and had also decided that she wanted to learn to read the surveyor's maps that were stored in the rolled-up tube in the study, because she felt that knowing where things were exactly was important. Peter showed her how to read them, and she absorbed it with a seriousness that made him think she was going to be, in about 15 years, a force of nature in whatever she decided to do. The winter came in December, cold and clear, and the property was ready for it. Peter had reinforced the livestock shelter, sealed the drafts in the main house, and laid in enough wood to carry them well past February. The four of them settled into the rhythms of a winter household, the long evenings with lamplight and the sound of the children at their schoolwork, and the smell of whatever Lavinia had on the stove, the particular piece of a house that is warm against the cold outside. He found in this settled time that the thing he had carried for 3 years without naming it, the restlessness, the sense of being perpetually between places, had simply stopped. He knew where he was. He was at the Sutton property, which was also now his property, in Dusty Creek, Texas, with a woman he loved completely and 2 children. He had come to love with a quieter but no less genuine depth, and the wood was stacked, and the fence lines were tight, and snow was falling outside the window, and supper was nearly ready. In January, Lavinia told him, on a quiet evening by the fire after the children were asleep, with a careful directness that was entirely her own, that she was expecting a child. She watched his face while she said it, which told him she had been weighing how he would take the news. He said, "That's wonderful." And then, because he wanted her to know, he meant it without reservation, genuinely wonderful. She studied him for a moment, and he could see her deciding something, and what she decided was to believe him, and the relief in her face at having decided that was something he kept for a long time. "I thought it might be soon," she said. "I hoped." A pause. "I was afraid to hope too much." "I know," he reached over and took her hand. "You're allowed to hope. I'm here." She looked at the fire. "I know you are," she said. "I'm still getting used to that." "Take your time," he said. "We have time." He woke early the next morning before dawn, in the cold dark of the bedroom they had shared for 4 months, and lay for a moment with his hand on the warmth of her shoulder as she slept, listening to the sound of the winter outside and the sleeping house around him, and thought about everything that had brought him to this specific moment in this specific room in this specific life, and felt such a fullness in his chest that it was almost difficult to contain. He got up quietly and went to the kitchen and started the stove, and put the coffee on, and stood at the kitchen window while the sky lightened from black to the deep blue-gray of very early morning, and thought about what he was going to say to Tommy. That conversation happened the following morning, just the two of them on the porch before Eliza was up, with coffee for Peter and warm milk with molasses for Tommy, which Tommy was technically getting too old to like but still did. Peter told him about the baby coming, and Tommy was quiet for a moment in the way he always was when something needed to settle. Then he said, "That's good news," and looked at Peter with a directness that was entirely his mother's. "It won't change anything with us, will it?" "No," Peter said. "Not in the way you mean." Tommy nodded. "Eliza's going to be impossible about it," he said, which was a prediction that proved entirely accurate. When Eliza heard, she immediately began drawing up plans for the baby's sleeping corner and suggested 3 names before breakfast was finished, none of which were agreed to, but all of which were considered with the seriousness they deserved. The spring of 1879 came in green and warm, and the property came to life with it. The calving season was excellent, the best on record for the Sutton land, and Peter rode the early pastures in the clear mornings and checked the new calves, and thought about what the herd would look like in another 2 years with proper management. He and Lavinia had drawn up a breeding plan over the winter that was both practical and ambitious, and Gil Tanner had expressed interest in a cooperative arrangement for the next June market that would benefit both operations. Doyle Casper had not come back, and word through town was that he had turned his attention to some land north of the county, which everyone who had known Lavinia Sutton for more than 5 minutes had predicted. He had simply waited for a moment of weakness that had not arrived. In April, Clara Harlan organized a small gathering for Lavinia at the store, which turned into an hour of women from the town sitting around the store's central table eating Clara's apple cake and talking about everything from seed prices to a new parcel library order that the schoolteacher had put in. And Lavinia sat in the middle of all of it with an ease that was new, the ease of a woman who has stopped spending so much energy holding herself apart from the world. Peter rode to collect her afterward and found her standing outside the store with Clara, the two of them talking with the warmth of old friends who have recently added something to their friendship that makes it richer, and Lavinia looked up when she heard his horse, and the look she gave him was unguarded in the afternoon sun, just open and warm and his. "Good gathering?" he asked, dismounting. "Clara's apple cake," Lavinia said, which he took as a yes. Clara beamed at both of them in the unrestrained way of someone who has been proven comprehensively right about something they cared about, and is not entirely above finding satisfaction in it. "You'll both come to supper Sunday," she said, in a tone that was not quite a question. "We'll come to supper Sunday," Lavinia agreed. On the ride home, with the spring evening light golden across the land and the horses moving easily on the familiar road, Lavinia rode beside him and looked out at the country she had fought for and held and turned into something that could last, and he looked at her in profile and thought that she was every bit as much a part of this landscape as the cottonwoods and the open sky, as essential and as enduring. "What are you thinking?" she asked, because she had learned by now when he was thinking something specific. That this was a very good decision, he said. She turned to look at him. "Coming here or staying here, both, all of it." She held his eyes for a moment, riding, and then she smiled, the full real smile that still hit him the same way it had the very first time he'd seen it. "Yes," she said, "it was." They rode home through the evening light, back along the road through the cottonwoods and out onto the open land, back to the gate he had ridden through the first morning and unlatched carefully, which he did again now, holding it open for her, and she rode through and waited while he latched it behind them, and they rode together up to the house where the smoke was beginning to rise from the kitchen chimney, because Tommy had started the stove without being asked. The summer of 1879 was long and warm and genuinely good. Peter finished a new storage room addition on the east side of the house, which Lavinia had been wanting for 2 years, and built a proper cradle from the good cedar he'd been saving since the winter because cedar repels insects, and because it was the best wood he had, and this particular piece of work deserved the best he had. He finished it on a June evening, while Lavinia sat in the kitchen chair nearby with her hands in her lap, and watched him do the final fitting with a quiet attention that he felt across his back as a warmth. When he set the cradle down and it rocked perfectly on the curved runners, she stood up and came over and put her hand on the side of it and set it rocking and stood there with the sound of it in the room. "It's beautiful," she said. She looked at him. "You're a good man, Peter Carver." He took her hand off the cradle and held it. "You're a good woman, Lavinia Carver." She had been Lavinia Carver for 9 months, and she still looked slightly surprised when she heard it, in the way that some changes to your name take a while to feel fully yours. But she looked at him when he said it with something that was satisfaction and warmth and permanence all at once. The baby came in August, a boy, solid and loud from the first moment, with a full head of dark hair and lungs that announced his presence to the entire property. They named him James Robert Carver, Robert for the man whose absence had made the space that James now occupied, which Lavinia had chosen, and which Peter had considered carefully and agreed was exactly right. When Lavinia first held him, in the bedroom in the gray light of early morning while the midwife packed up, and Peter sat on the edge of the bed with the specific exhausted relief of someone who has been holding vigil through a long night, she looked at James Robert with an expression he had never seen from her before. Not the composure and not the strength and not the pride, just pure open love, unmanaged and complete. Tommy appeared in the doorway in his nightshirt with his hair standing up from sleep, took one look at his mother and the baby and said, "He's small." "He won't stay small," Lavinia said. Eliza pushed past Tommy into the room with no ceremony and went straight to look at the baby with the focused attention of a scientist examining a new specimen. "He has your nose," she told her mother. Then to Peter, "He has your chin." She appeared to find this distribution satisfactory. Peter put his arm around Tommy's shoulders and Tommy, who was trying to look 13 and composed, leaned against him for just a moment before straightening up. "Good," Tommy said, in the understated way he had, which meant more than the word contained. In the months that followed, the Carver household settled into the rhythm of itself. Tommy, who was well into 13 by autumn, had taken on more of the cattle work with a growing competence that impressed even old Gil Tanner, who was not easily impressed. Eliza had persuaded the schoolteacher to order a geography book from back east that was not part of the curriculum, and had read it cover to cover 3 times. James Robert grew, as predicted, and the cedar cradle rocked and the house had the warm noise that a house with 4 people and a new baby has, the constant hum of life being lived. On a clear October evening, with the last of the summer heat gentling into the golden cool of autumn, Peter sat on the porch with Lavinia, while James Robert slept in the cradle inside, and the older children did their evening chores in the barn. The sky was doing something extraordinary, the Texas autumn sky, all orange and deep red along the horizon, and stars just beginning to appear in the darkening east. Lavinia was knitting something practical, as she always was when she sat still, but she was looking at the sky rather than her work, and he sat beside her in the easy, full silence that had become the characteristic sound of their life together. After a while she said, without preamble, "I almost sent you away that first morning. I know. I had the speech ready. I'd given it 3 times already. Clara told me." She looked at him sideways with the dry amusement she reserved for Clara's particular variety of involvement. "I'm sure she did." She looked back at the sky. "I'm glad I didn't. So am I." She set down the knitting and turned to face him properly in the direct way she had when she wanted something to be heard clearly. "I was so certain," she said, that accepting help meant admitting I couldn't do it on my own, that it made everything I'd already done smaller. She paused. It didn't. No, he said. It made it bigger, because you'd already done everything that needed doing. You just needed someone to stand next to you while you kept doing it. She looked at him steadily. That's exactly what you did. That's all I ever wanted to do. She was quiet, and the last of the sunset was fading and the stars were coming out over the pasture, and somewhere inside the house James Robert made a small sound and settled again. And from the barn came the low voices of Tommy and Eliza having some small argument about the proper way to store tack. Everything was exactly as it should be. I love you, Lavinia said, simply and directly, the way she did everything. I don't say it every day because I'm not built that way. But I mean it every day. I know you do, he said. I can tell. She smiled at him, the full smile, and picked up her knitting, and they sat together on the porch while the Texas night settled around them, warm and dark and full of stars. He thought about Bud Macy's warning on that first morning, what felt now like a different life, prickly and proud and impossible to help. He thought about his own answer, which he'd given with a confidence that had been more instinct than certainty at the time. Those are the ones who need it most. He hadn't been wrong about that. But he'd been missing the more important truth, which was this. The ones who are prickly and proud and impossible to help are also, sometimes, the ones who have the most to give once they decide you've earned it. The ones who guard themselves fiercely love fiercely. The ones who have held themselves together through everything hold the things they love together too, with the same stubborn, unbreakable strength. He looked at Lavinia in the lamplight from the window. This woman who had kept 60 acres and 2 children, and a leaning barn alive through 2 Texas winters alone, who had walked into a bank and made her case with a precision that had impressed a banker who didn't impress easily, who had looked Doyle Casper in the eye and told him exactly where his legal argument failed, who had set a ring on her own finger with a steady hand and said, "We own it," who held her new son with unguarded love, and argued about Sir Walter Scott with genuine passion, and made coffee every morning of the world without asking whether anyone wanted it because they always wanted it. He thought he had done her a favor by coming here and not giving up and doing good work and staying when he said he would. He thought that less now. What he thought now was that she had given him something so much larger in return that the accounting was not even close to even, and he was glad of it. The wind moved through the cottonwoods beyond the gate and the stars burned over Texas, and the house was warm and the barn was solid and the fence lines were tight, and Peter Carver sat next to the woman he loved on the porch of the life they had built together, and felt, in every particular, that this was home. In the spring of 1880, when the bluebonnets came up along the south fence line in a blue so vivid it stopped your breath, Tommy Carver, who was 14 and growing into his father's height in his mother's eyes, rode the property line for the first time entirely alone, and came back to report that everything was in good order, that the north post had shifted slightly and he'd restaked it, and that there were 12 new calves in the east pasture and all of them were strong. Lavinia listened to the report and said, "Well done," in the tone she used for things that actually were, and Tommy nodded with the dignity of a young man who has earned something real. Eliza, who was 10 now and had already decided that she was going to learn surveying properly when she was old enough, spent that spring afternoon with the surveyor's maps spread on the kitchen table and a stub of pencil, marking out the measurements that she was going to verify on foot as soon as her mother said she could. Peter watched her from the doorway and thought about what she was going to be at 20, and felt the warm, unreasonable pride of a father who has watched someone extraordinary grow from the beginning. James Robert, at 8 months, had already developed a personality of spectacular forcefulness, which he expressed primarily through the volume of his opinions about mealtimes and the indignity of naps. He also laughed at a frequency and a pitch that stopped everything else in any room he was in, because it was impossible to hear it and not respond. On that May afternoon, with the bluebonnets wild along the fence and the calves in the east pasture, and Tommy on his horse and Eliza at her maps and James Robert asleep for the moment in his cedar cradle. Peter came into the kitchen and put his arms around Lavinia from behind while she stood at the counter making bread, and she leaned back against him in the easy, natural way she had learned to do and looked out the window at the Texas spring. "What are you doing?" she asked. "Nothing useful," he said. "Peter Carver doing nothing useful," she said. "I'll mark it on the calendar." He laughed against her hair. She turned in his arms and looked up at him with those sage-colored eyes that were warm now with something that had no wall in front of it, just open and full and entirely his. He thought, again and not for the last time, of that first morning at the gate and the warning and his own reply. Those are the ones who need it most. He had been right. He had also, he knew now, been the one who needed it most. She reached up and put her hand on his face with a directness that was all her, and he put his hand over hers, and they stood in the kitchen of the house on the property they owned together. And outside the bluebonnets were brilliant and the calves were in the pasture, and the fence lines were tight and the barn wall was straight and everything was exactly, fully, and permanently good.